All right, guys. Thank you, Noah.
Yeah,
Really
good to be
excited to be
here.
here. Absolutely. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the Mississippi Museum of Art for allowing us to do this here. Um, Great venue, and I think it's fitting for the topic that we're going to discuss, which is the brain drain, which is a topic that many people have delved into before in the past, but I think we're going to have a different spin
Yeah,
on it.
hopefully so. I really like where I think we're heading with this today and charting some new ground instead of kind of talking about in circles about why people are leaving the state.
Absolutely. So, Noah, you are a Rhodes Scholar
Yep,
and you went to Millsaps. So you have, yeah, you've lived obviously in Jackson for a while, and then you lived overseas. So fill in the blanks for me.
absolutely. Grown up down a gravel road in Pontotoc County, Mississippi, decided to go to Millsaps and had the incredible fortune of winning a Rhodes Scholarship my senior year, which sent me to the University of Oxford, the oldest school in the world, where the dorm I lived in turned 700 years old in about 6 years. Um, Got to experience the world, Mississippi boy abroad, and have lots of great Mississippi memories while abroad, and got to see 20 countries in 2 years. But seeing all of that makes me love Mississippi even more, but also kind of see where we have room to improvement. And Trey, I remember reaching out to you
Hmm.
3 years ago and just a cold email because I was following you, seeing the cool initiatives you were working on, and really thought you were an innovator for the state. Where I think a lot of times we like to kind of recycle ideas
Sure.
that are like 6 years old from other states. And I saw you kind of pushing the cutting edge, and you've been a great mentor to me. Thankful that you invited me to be on here with you today.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. We did connect. It was 3 years ago, and um, I appreciate that.
Yeah, tell me about some of these projects you've been working on that have piqued my interest and we've had many conversations about.
Yeah. So I've been practicing law for over 10 years now. I'm a partner at Butler Snow, and I'm in the public finance, tax incentives, and economic development group. And so I get a chance to see a lot of cool things that are not only happening in Mississippi, but throughout the Southeast because we have a pretty big footprint. And my background and my passion really is in economic development. My first job that I really just sank my teeth into was at the Mississippi Development Authority.
Hmm.
And Leland Speed was the executive director at the time that I was there, and he was quite the innovator, not only for the agency but for the state in taking companies public, et cetera. And so, I grew up here too. Grew up right here in Jackson.
And you've also had the experience to go to some great educational institution. I think you spent a semester at Brown,
Yeah.
another semester at NYU, and you've also gotten the opportunity to see the world. Do you think it kind of helped put a focus on what Mississippi is doing well and what we could do better?
I definitely think so. And New York was an interesting place, obviously, and Tougaloo College has a rich history and tradition, but within that rich history and tradition, there's a long-standing exchange program with Brown University. And so during my junior year, I got a chance to spend a semester in Providence, Rhode Island. And then I spent the following semester in New York, right in the heart of the village. I learned a lot. Life and experience will teach you lessons. And from that experience and the perspectives that I gained and amassed, they certainly shed light on, things in my state, in our state, that
Absolutely.
could be better. Certain things that I really appreciated. I appreciated the ability to, be able to go to the market and pick up things, and it's a little different going to the market in New York. So, yeah, there were things that I certainly appreciated about that experience, the people, the culture, the openness. So, with the projects that I've been able to work on over the years, I do think those experiences shaped it, shaped how I looked at the world, looked at trying to be creative, find a solution to a problem, or I've had the opportunity to write a lot of legislation, and sometimes that legislation sort of pushes the cutting edge. Maybe it's something related to healthcare, or wrote some legislation recently about commuter rail. different ways to look at public-private partnerships, all of those different types of financing structures that might not ordinarily work or be something that we would like to fit within the peg here in Mississippi. And so it's always about trying to be innovative.
Mm. How about we hop into our focus today?
Yeah,
The brain drain is economic development enough?
sure.
And I know we've had a lot of discussions about this. And most of the things that we've read are focused on jobs, kind of classic economic development, bringing those higher paying jobs there and connecting students in Mississippi to those jobs. But we both agree that that's just part of what we should be looking at, and there's
Sure.
lots of other stuff. Do you want to talk about kind of how you see generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So that experience at MDA and connecting it to some of the things that I do now, there's certainly a real gap and some variables that we really need to work on. And I do think we are struggling to keep and retain our best and brightest. And I think there's some strategic ways that we could work on that, but it certainly involves quality of life. It involves affordable housing. It involves entertainment. It involves access to healthcare, and ultimately, it involves creating the types of jobs that those young professionals might want to take advantage of, or seek out gainful employment in those particular sectors and areas. And so sometimes where we lack some depth and just the ability to do some of the things that we want to do in the state, I think is from the standpoint of you know going after headquarters and going after the companies that are on the cutting edge. And so, how can we use some of the things that make us potentially weak
Mm.
as a strength? And that might involve our culture, our music, maybe even healthcare. And I know I've there's sort of a digital footprint out there with me talking about things like healthcare as an economic driver, but just as a quick aside or synopsis, I do think that we should spend a tremendous amount of money in areas where we are weak because we can build those things up to make them really strong. And so if we have the highest or one of the highest incidences of diabetes, why not focus on spending money to research diabetes or cancer or whatever it might be? But I know that the vaccine for COVID-19 was not, that cure or that vaccine was not developed in our state.
Yeah.
Although we've got some of the brightest minds around, but they're leaving our state. And so they may be going to Massachusetts or Connecticut or to those areas where that research is taking place. And we've really got to focus on not having a Pollyannic view of how we're doing
Absolutely.
as a state and really embrace that there are some weaknesses that we can work on.
This has become a lot more salient for me in the last year and a half because I've trained as an economist and like looking at data and like seeing trends. And it wasn't that bad a couple years ago when we could look to our peer states,
Sure.
the ones surrounding us, and saying, okay, they're in the same situation as us. So it's fine. We can keep doing what we're doing. We can sit on it. But recently, our peer states have started to leave us in the dust. Last year, I pulled a bunch of data and tracked it from 1990 to 2020, and then projecting out what it would take for Mississippi to do to meet the median in the U.S. by 2050. And what I noticed from those numbers is not only are we last in a lot of categories, but we're last in diverging from the mean. We're not catching up. So I think this is the time for us to hop on these ideas, spend the money that unfortunately we have to spend it to start catching up. Because every day that goes by, this divergence keeps happening, whether it's income per capita, whether it's life expectancy, whether it's diabetes, like you said, whether it's the percentage of elected officials who are female, all of those, we're diverging from the mean. I'm concerned that if we can't get young people to stay in the state, get involved with the state, that we're never going to be able to catch up.
So you currently live in the state, and you traveled to how many countries right now, you think?
Yeah, so I've been to 30 and
Wow.
20 in the last 2 years when I lived in England. And currently, I'm working for a nonprofit in Chicago and a large financial institution in New York from my bedroom in Tupelo. But as soon as things lifting, I'm going to be one of the ones that's going to be gone for at least some point in time.
And tell me the thought process behind someone who would like to stay in the state, who wants to, you have a desire to go and learn and see the world, etc. But there's certainly a desire to come back, but there's also the notion that you have to leave.
Yeah, it's a pull and push, and I think we all have it, and it comes in waves. Because there was times when I was living in England where I would go to the American Library and just sit down and read books about Mississippi, and I would draft articles to try to publish in the Tupelo Daily Journal or something, just because I missed it. But then there's other times, when I think about it, and I don't have hope that Mississippi is going to get to where I want it to be, and it's like an internal struggle, trying to figure out how to navigate that, how to kind of nurture this place I love, but also kind of take care of myself and then also the people that I love who don't live in the state.
Tell me this, as a young person, from just a quality of life standpoint, what do you truly value? What, on a scale of 1 to 10, what are those pecking orders of things that a young person, and I'm 41 now, so not necessarily the oldest, but older than you, but what do you look for?
And I think this is important that we don't talk a lot, because I think when young people, 20-year-olds, fresh out of college, when they're thinking about where they're going to move, they're not opening up a spreadsheet, figuring out where they're going to have the highest lifetime value of earnings or where they're going to get the best jobs. They're looking at what's cool, what's progressing, not in like a progressive way, just like what every single day is it getting better? Every month is the place I'm living getting better, and can I contribute to that? For me, I think the number one thing is kind of being where the action's happening, where things are changing and where things are evolving and I can get involved with it. And also being in a place where every day I know the next day is going to be better and the month after that's going to be better. And we're moving forward. My kids are going to be able to move forward. My spouse is going to be able to move forward. And that's what I'm looking at. And sometimes when I'm in Mississippi, I hate to say it, I just don't feel like month by month we're doing that.
Yeah. So I was in Birmingham for meetings last night, and just a quick trip there, and whether it's Rossbridge or downtown Birmingham, there's a distinction, and there's
It's my favorite distinction to talk. Let's talk about Birmingham.
Yeah, let's dive into it. I mean, just the skyline, or and it's not the capital city, which is shocking from the standpoint of the South, the Deep South, but the same can be said of other large states throughout the South that have, major metropolitan areas that don't happen to be the capital, and that might be Louisiana with New Orleans, or Texas with, dear God, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. The list goes on, and then Austin, which is its own, major metropolitan area in its own right. It has its own identity. Each of those cities have their own identity, and whether it's Tennessee with Nashville, or Memphis, or Florida that has Miami and Tallahassee, the capital, and Orlando, etc. But looking at Birmingham, and just Alabama, the surrounding area, there's all of these different amenities.
There's energy.
There's exactly right. And I wish there were a way to capture that here in a ball and just, energize everybody with that same amount of momentum going forward. I think, Jackson and Mississippi, we're in the last vestige of the old South. Sort of a way of thinking that doesn't necessarily match up with the rest of the country. And for a lot of people, there's a lot of value in that. The status quo, the haves and the have-nots, and I would posit that that's one of the main reasons that it took so very long to get the flag down. And it's 2021, and I was reading a book by Joseph Crispino talking about just the state and how it's evolved, and there are all of these various passages talking about how segregation really didn't have an impact on economic development in Mississippi. And, he was arguing against it, but government at the time, that was the major premise. It has no bearing. Our way of life, our way of thinking has no bearing, and the rest of the world does not judge us, but the world does. And that may be one of the several reasons why we might not be as advantageous in the world of economic development for some of the really high tech projects, or the projects that, it's one thing to have projects that create a plethora of jobs, but there's another when the jobs are really valued, when they can really change and move one group of people from one bracket to another. And whether it's back office, et cetera, vice presidents making decisions that affect the world. I know we're going to be a state that's going to have to punch above its weight. That's just a matter of fact in terms of our economy, the size of our economy. Got about a $2.8 billion budget. So it's always going to be a struggle. But if we make decisions, I think that are really honed on not incremental change, but really just transcendental change.
That's one of the things I think about a lot in Mississippi, is how we can take advantage of kind of these leaps, where we can jump over an era of technology and just jump over that thing in the middle that other people did to the next thing.
Sure.
And I'm worried that a lot of these trends are going to hurt Mississippi if we don't get on it. I can imagine a world where 10 years from now, which I think is a reasonable timeline, where we all have self-driving cars, and everyone lives these kind of fabulous lives in the city, and then on the weekend they just hop in their self-driving car, take a nap, and they're at their hunting camp in Mississippi, and no one lives here, or something like that. I'm worried about these future trends, and especially also the impacts of possible changing climate, whatever that may be, if it happens. What's your perspective on the future? I think you're probably more hopeful than I am.
With respect to the flag, that gave me a lot of hope. There were people around me who would ask my opinion. Do you think it's going to happen? And I just didn't think that it was possible.
I didn't either.
And just a little bit of the inside baseball. Obviously, when MEC stepped up, and they have stepped up in the past, they've really pushed this in the past. But, sports is vitally important, not only in the South, but especially in Mississippi. And I think when that began to happen, I think you had a real groundswell. I think there was some politics at play in terms of our legislature and the Black Caucus that stood firm, resolute, and saying this has to happen this way.
And the churches coming in.
Oh, absolutely. That was huge. The Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church.
Didn't expect that.
Yeah. And
forceful statements, not just we're behind this. We want this to happen. So let's talk about cities, because I think that's been the most interesting trend in Southern economic development. Everywhere, from Charlotte to Atlanta to Birmingham to all the Texas cities, are booming. Jobs are moving there. People are moving there. It's the only place in the U.S. that's seen a net population gain. People are pouring out of California, coming to southern cities. They're pouring out of Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, but they're not coming to Mississippi. What do we do? Do we think it's Jackson? Do we think it's beefing up DeSoto County? Do we think it's Hattiesburg? Do we spread our resources? I think it's Jackson. What do you think?
I think your suspicion is right. I was on a panel 2 or 3 years ago, and Ebony Lumumba was on the panel as well. David Farr, some real thinkers who were just grappling with this issue. And the topic was, can Mississippi save Jackson? And I think we can think about it the other way as well. Can Jackson save Mississippi? And I firmly, wholeheartedly believe that our state leadership and our municipal leadership in our largest city in the state of Mississippi should be in a room once a week. I think we have multiple problems as a state. There's education that we're constantly trying to enhance with teacher pay raises. There's access to health care. There's infrastructure. But I think if you really go about tackling the issue of brain drain, and I think, you know, how do you do that? And I think it's focusing on the capital city. I think it's unfortunately it's going to take a ton of money, but it's necessary. And from the standpoint of connecting downtown to the airport, why is that not? Why is the state and the surrounding municipalities and the counties? Let's figure out how to do that. Sure, no one wants to necessarily pay higher taxes, but these are some things that are vitally necessary to be able to compete. Alabama spends a tremendous amount of money, the football team, on recruiting and their stadium and their facilities. So we need to do the same thing. If we want to be competitive, it is going to take a tremendous amount of money to be able to do that. And so that might mean light rail. That might mean, there's a project that I'm working on, the Jackson Tech District. It might mean saying, look, we want to help. We want to spend the money to make this project work. And we want to do it together. We don't want to fight, Democrat, Republican, Independent. I don't care. We all are in the same boat, and the boat is upward mobility. And so there are specific things. I mean, we're slowly getting there. And like I said earlier, this is the last vestige of what we know to be the old South. And, our leadership is a lot more diverse, but I firmly believe that in diversity, there is a plurality. There's enhanced thinking. More money can be made. More voices can be heard. So I really think Jackson can save Mississippi, and Mississippi can save Jackson.
I agree. The thing that Jackson doesn't have going for it is had misfortune about where the anchor institutions in our state ended up. All of these cities, if you look at kind of their turnaround, they normally always had some large anchor institution that pulled it. And unfortunately, the University of Mississippi isn't here. Mississippi State isn't here. Hattiesburg isn't here. Another institution that generally serves that purpose is a Fortune 500 company, which there's not one of those in Jackson. Same thing to go for the medical systems. That's what we have. But if you look at the footprint of the medical community in Jackson, it's much smaller than what you see in neighboring cities. And I think what turned around Birmingham was UAB and their two Fortune 500 companies that they have in the city. I think currently at this point, like 1 in 5 people in the entire city of Birmingham is employed by UAB. And it's just taken over the city because they invested in it. And the wild part about UAB, it's not this institution that's been around for 300 years. It's like a 60-year-old institution that the state and the communities pumped money into to create these synergies.
Sure.
And that's what cities have going for them, is they create these economies of scale. And they're not for everyone. We're not forcing people to leave their lovely rural lives to move to it, but it's an option that we need to be able to give our citizens and the people that are looking at Mississippi. Can I live in a place that's charming but has all of these amenities that big cities have?
I don't disagree. But what Jackson does have that, I don't know, I mean, that's comparable to a lot of other cities. You've got Millsaps, Belhaven, Tougaloo College, Jackson State University, UMC, Hines, and all of these are within a very close proximity to each other.
They are.
But there's no real catalyst. There's no synergy bringing all of those things together. In this country right now, after George Floyd, HBCU's enrollment is up. Jackson State recently recruited Deion Sanders to become the head coach of Jackson State University's football team. So there are some synergies, and we have to take what we have and really invest in it.
We do.
And use that as an anchor and a tool to promote the state, to promote what we have and what we're doing really great. And I think, Jackson State University very close to my parents are alums of Jackson State. I went to Tougaloo College, but very soon, I think Jackson State will touch downtown. But I also think that if there were more investment from the state and our federal partners
Yep.
in that particular vein that they meet, and programs that would stimulate and recruit students here to Jackson, and that there were, there's light rail, there's a thriving airport that now has Southwest Airlines again. I think things like that, if we truly focused on those particular efforts, it would make us so much more of a valuable asset.
Yeah. Well, Trey, I know we've talked about some of your friends over the last couple years who have left the state. Had great things going for them here, but decided to relocate. I haven't really had any of those people in my life yet because they're most of the people I know are kind of young students and we're all over the place all the time anyway. Tell me what you think drove their decision to leave, and if you think they're going to come back. And for every one of those people, do you see someone like that from another city, from another place in the U.S. being like, "Oh, I'm going to move to Jackson, or I'm going to move to Mississippi"?
And that's it, Noah. There's one thing to retain talent, but there's another to attract it.
Mm.
And if you build from a platform and an infrastructure where you're actually attracting talent, you'll retain it as well. And so,
Great point.
one of my good friends, she's a lawyer. She's moving to DC next month. I don't think she's going to return. Yes, her family's here. There are reasons that I have remained, why I've gotten involved, whether it be, supporting a certain candidate or working on a particular issue. But from her perspective, I think she just finds more value and opportunity, more things to do. She's very involved in the junior league, but there are opportunities like that in other places. Right now you can probably run a business from anywhere in the world, so you don't necessarily have to be in Mississippi or a certain jurisdiction. People are looking for things that enhance their quality of life. Life is stressful enough as it is. Getting up, going to work, the trudge, taking care of kids, etc. You want to be able to do things that are going to minimize stress. And I was reading something recently about countries where, I think it's the Nordic countries, that have the least amount of stress level in their populations, versus places like Mississippi, where we have some spikes in certain health disparities, comorbidities. We've got to really think about those types of things as we're building out this infrastructure that's going to help us to attract the most talented and keep our most talented.
And how do we get people to come to Mississippi from states you don't think of? Recently, I pulled the data about where every year the IRS sees where people file tax forms. So they can tell where someone filed one year and what they did the next year. So you can see where people, when they left Mississippi, where they went, and people who came to Mississippi, where they came from. And I noticed from that there's Mississippi people going just about everywhere. There's Mississippians going to Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois and all sorts of places. But if you look at the reverse, there's no one coming from those states. How much of that do you think is the state's kind of reputation, what people think of? When I was living in England and was traveling around Europe, and I told people I was from Mississippi, everyone knows what Mississippi is. I stopped telling people I was just from the U.S. I was telling them I'm from Mississippi because they know it. And one night it was like 3 a.m. on a flight to Israel from the UK. And this German guy was sitting next to me on the plane. He goes, "I know 3 things about Mississippi." And he was very excited to tell me his 3 facts. One of them, the Mississippi River. Okay, I'll give him that.
Sure.
Next one, Huckleberry Finn. No, not really. The third one, racism. And that's the only 3 things he knew about the state. And that was repeated over and over and over again in the interactions I had with people. They also, a lot of them know who William Faulkner is. That's the thing. But do you think It's these people just not having the exposure or having kind of a view of Mississippi that it may not be outdated, but may make them not want to come to the state.
Absolutely. We certainly don't want to forget our history,
Absolutely.
but there's a certain amount of getting to the point where we can embrace that history and shape or reshape a new history. And I think that started with our state flag. But obviously, racism is everywhere throughout the country, throughout the world. But given what we went through during the civil rights movement and the vestiges of racism that still exists today, diversity is so vitally important. Diversity and inclusivity. It's one thing to have a diverse group of people, but at the inclusivity
Absolutely.
standpoint and engaging and having thought process and having those individuals having a seat at the table. Like, I am currently on the executive committee at my law firm. I was the second African American to be elected to our executive committee since our firm's founding in 1954. And I think I'm the youngest.
Wow.
Since that time, since I got elected over a year ago, we've added 2 other African American executive committee members who are tremendous lawyers. But I'll tell you this, with respect to the decisions that are being made, I wholeheartedly believe that when you have diversity of thought and perspective, that it makes you a better organization, a better state. And so I really believe, from the standpoint of our state government, municipal government, we have to really do a better job of listening and having meaningful dialogues. That we're still not there, and I struggle. I really struggled after George Floyd.
Yeah.
What's my purpose? What should I be doing? How can I mentor other young African American lawyers in the firm? Sure, I've got a seat at the table of the executive committee, but what am I truly doing? And so, whether it's the pro bono project that I mentioned earlier, that I think will check the boxes on hopefully the brain drain component of why people can potentially stay or recruit people here. But we have to have great ideas, big ideas, ideas that will reshape and change. And so you need to meet this young woman. Her name is Nashley Cephas. She has a PhD from Georgia Tech. She grew up here in Mississippi.
I've heard about her.
Yeah, and she's just dynamic. And it was my wife who saw me struggling, who said, this is what you need to do. You need to help her with this project. And the firm stepped up. We gave her a $100,000 bill credit.
Wow.
And that's not insignificant in terms of the amount of time and effort, but she closed on the first piece of property and is hopefully closing on a second. And so we've got engineers, we've got architects, all looking at how to create this district where, in her background, she works for Amazon currently, and she is in the artificial intelligence, in that particular division. But she was a member and a part of another company called PartPick that was purchased by Amazon. And she developed the facial recognition algorithms. And so she's brilliant, and she wants to take those same concepts and, through her nonprofit and the for-profit, educate and engage and give people opportunities to be creative. And so from an innovative standpoint, maybe it's someone who has an idea around cooking. Well, there are stations and various things to help them to be able to do that. Maybe someone has an idea around creating a new type of widget. Well, there will be, tools and things of that nature to help them to be able to do that. But from the standpoint of your really high tech, computer technology or AI, those things will be readily available as well. And so you've got the for-profit and the nonprofit, affordable housing component, mixed use component. I would love to see all of the universities engaging in some meaningful way with her and Amazon and all of those partners at this one site. And lo and behold, the district sits right between downtown Jackson and Jackson State
Wow.
University. So I mean, that's one of the transcendental projects that I think would really transform not only Jackson but the state. And so we have to get behind the really big ideas. The ideas that you think that might be a little far-fetched, those are the ones that I think that will propel us to the next level.
And you got to think that we are best positioned out of all of the states to experiment, because the only thing that we have to lose is if we do nothing or we kind of keep on the same old path. We have to innovate. We're to that position. What do you think it's going to take to push us over the edge where people get together and be like, we've got to start trying these cutting edge, crazy things in some cases? Some of them are going to work. Some of them are going to work. Is there a point in time at which maybe we fall so behind the median of the US that we get there? Or do you think it's going to take just like a crazy innovative person to just inspire us all? What do you think? What do you think is going to happen?
I struggle with that. I really do. I mean, it's a certain mentality I think that we have developed that we can't get the types of projects that other states get. That maybe we're only relegated to, hardcore manufacturing. And these are great jobs. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
They're tremendous jobs that
Absolutely.
we need, but they're not transformative jobs. They don't propel us to the next level to be able to compete. It's kind of like the SEC. I mean, how do we compete with the Alabamas and the LSUs? And maybe we'll have a few games where, a season like how we did really great, but how do we consistently compete? And I do think it's going to take something transformative like that. And I worry in terms of the mentality that we can only aspire towards so much, that we are relegated to being a manufacturing state. Is it because of the educational system? Is it because of the agrarian delta with numerous landowners that don't necessarily want manufacturing or, artificial intelligence? These really high-tech companies coming in. Land is potentially cheap, but that particular portion of the state, when someone has the opportunity to leave, they leave. Because there aren't the opportunities that, and I mean, there are pockets. Don't get me wrong. My good friend, the mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, Eric Simmons, is doing a phenomenal job, but he needs more ammunition.
Yeah.
He needs more help, not only from the state, but from the federal government, I think. And it's not all about seeking assistance and help, but I do think that for so long as a state, race, lack of diversity, lack of a forethought has really held us back. And I think we can make significant strides if we really, and with the flag, I think we could turn a new page.
Yeah. So Trey, in my studies, I think a lot about wealth inequality, particularly in the South, and particularly black-white wealth inequality. And I think it's going to be one of the most difficult things for us to solve as a country and as a state. All these barriers being in place, the citizens clubs and everything that just created these chasms. And unfortunately, one of the only saying that's true is that your first million's your hardest. And wealth begets wealth. How do we bridge that gap and decrease that inequality so that we can move forward? I don't think we have a path if we don't.
I think Noah, I think it starts at the top. And you have to have African Americans, and we're talking about black and white, a state that struggled with that, still struggles with that. you have to have people in the room. You have to have people that are in the room that have the ability to provide advice, actionable advice, and that actionable advice has to be taken. If someone tells you they're struggling and these are the problems that they're facing, you have to take them at face value. And the statistics that you outline, they're real. And from the standpoint of race, I mean, we're the African Americans in Mississippi and the U.S. We're starting from a point of disadvantage. We traveled to Colorado over the new year, and we drove through the Mississippi Delta, the Arkansas Delta, through Fort Smith, and through Oklahoma, and we stopped in Tulsa. And we stopped at the Black Wall Street that I've read about and had known about, but the kids didn't. My wife didn't really know a lot about it, had heard about it, but to think about a community that had amassed that much wealth, and for those who are listening who don't know the story, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had numerous African American millionaires that had thriving businesses. It was an area, Greenwood Avenue area of Tulsa, that just had so much wealth, and it was wiped out. It was completely wiped out. People were lynched, killed, maimed, etc., and it was completely wiped off the face of the earth. Same can be said for Rosewood and other areas throughout the country. So, it's I think going back to diversity and inclusivity, you have to have solid advisors, in the room that have different perspectives, and you have to listen to them. You have to have a staff that is very diverse. I think you have to have that in terms of leadership in our legislature and in all walks of life. You have to have diversity of thought and you have to have inclusivity, because if you don't, that's where we're going to fail. And so, from my own perspective, when you're fighting from a disadvantage and there's so much inequality and the haves continue to have more and the have nots have less, and the status quo wants to remain the same. George Floyd, it was a struggle because I saw that inequality in America.
Yeah.
And what I struggled so much over was that there's the status quo that, maybe there was wealth that was created by someone's parents, and then that wealth got created and that person didn't have student loans or et cetera. But maybe that person did have student loans. And maybe they worked and they were poor, but they're still not Black.
Mm.
They're still not Black. You still don't necessarily face the same, prejudices and inequities, racism that someone that has a different skin color might face. So it was a real struggle, and it's that movement for me was about tapping into how can I, Trey, help make a difference. So back to your question, I could give you specific recommendations. I'm always writing something or giving someone an idea, create a loan fund using PPP, or create a specific affordable housing fund, create a women's venture capital fund, create an African American venture capital fund.
It's not going to happen as an accident.
Right. It has to be very intentional.
Very intentional.
But what we have to realize is that the rising tide lifts all boats. We will be better as a people and a state and a country if all of us are doing better. It's not rocket science. We will do better. We will do better from an education standpoint, healthcare. If the have-nots have more, we will all do better. It simply means the haves will probably make even more as a result of the have-nots making more. There's enough to go around for everybody.
And I think this is going to be the story of the 21st century in the U.S. and in Mississippi. Because these numbers are just, it's so drastic that in the U.S., the average white household has 7 times the wealth as the average black household, holding everything constant. And if you happen to live in a city like Boston, which everyone thinks it's a kind of a more progressive place in these metrics, the average white family has about $250,000 in wealth, and the average black family has about $12. And that's a stat from 2017. $12. And like you said, we have to be so intentional, and we have to talk about it. We have to hit this head on, because these are numbers that are going to diverge.
Absolutely.
Money begets money. Investment begets investment. And you're starting off from 2 different places. How do we get that V to move in?
It is an existential. It's not. I mean, we're almost at a point of being in an existential crisis in terms of making these intentional decisions, particularly about our state.
Particularly,
we really have to make some transformative decisions that that make the headlines of the New York Times. Like, look what Mississippi is doing. And so
people would have a conniption if they saw in the New York Times that the governor pledges to end black-white wealth inequality in the next 50 years. It would make the headline in every newspaper.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It would be all the, like, well, how does he do it? And certainly we could figure out some ways to do that around education, healthcare, and African American businesses. But just in every organization or every state agency in the state of Mississippi, as a result of the racial demographics of our state, there ought to be some form or semblance of African American leadership in every one of those agencies. I'm not saying run the agency, or maybe run the agency, but there needs to be these voices that are represented at every level.
Do you think it's naturally coming? Mississippi, a lot of people are shocked to hear, have the highest number of black elected officials, not only as a number, but as a percentage of the population. We lead in both those. But when you look at the top, it's not what it looks like at all.
Yeah.
Do you think that power is building to get there? Or do we need to be more intentional than just waiting for it to happen?
I think we need to be more intentional. But I think time will tell. Obviously, I think the stats say that around 2035, Mississippi will be a majority African American state. Now, granted, a lot of our most talented, progressive, millennials are moving to places like Georgia. And so you saw some political shifts there, and you're seeing it in other places around the country. But I do think there's a certain type of political dynamic to some of the decisions that we make, or or not make. So from that standpoint, it's probably, unless it's intentional, unless there is a real strategic grassroots effort to make that happen, to have more seats at the table, whether it be, so we don't have a lot of Fortune 500 companies in our state, very few, maybe 1 or 2 that are headquartered here. But when you look around the country, statistically, there are very few African Americans on the boards of Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. But when you look at their financial, wherewithal, you'll see that the companies that have that diversity there, that were very intentional about it, they're doing extremely well. And I think that could be said for other areas where very critical decisions are being made from the top to the bottom.
And I think one of the most appealing things about what we're talking about is that you never have to bring in political party. None of this is a Republican issue. None of this is a Democrat issue. It's just bringing the people together to get behind it. And I think it's going to happen eventually. But we got to get over this partisanship. We got to get over people, immediately shutting each other down because you think that you see one way or the other. To have people talking about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Noah, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here and just talk about some really important issues. And I think we begin to scratch the surface, and I think we'll continue to have these dialogues. But really, really appreciate your time and just your acumen and economics and the statistics. So really proud of you.
Thanks for having me, Trey. This has been wonderful. I think we've made some progress, done some good ideas, and there's lots more conversations to have. And I'm really looking forward to our future conversations. And I'm really thankful that the Mississippi Museum of Art had us here today. About 5 feet from where 2 years ago I met Justice Sonia Sotomayor in Mississippi, nonetheless.
Well, I think going forward, a good call to action and the questions that we should continue to ask ourselves: can Mississippi save Jackson? And can Jackson save Mississippi? And I would encourage our elected officials, our business people, our strategic thinkers to continue to engage around those questions and really put forth some ideas and really creative approaches to how we can really answer that question and make this place one that's enviable to all.
Absolutely.
Thank you.